The delivery room fell silent except for the sound of 7 newborn cries piercing the air simultaneously. Kenny McCaughey stood frozen, his legs threatening to give way beneath him, as nurses moved in a carefully choreographed dance around his wife Bobbi. 1 baby, 2 babies, 3, he counted through tears he didn't know he was capable of shedding. 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 daughters. 7 tiny miracles entering the world at once, each one fighting for her first breath, each one defying the odds that doctors had warned them about for months. It was 1987, and the small farming community of Carlisle, Iowa, population barely scraping 3,000, was about to become the center of a story that would capture hearts across America and around the world. But in that moment, as Kenny watched the medical team work with urgent precision, splitting his daughters between 7 warming stations, all he could think about was a single, terrifying question: how do we possibly do this? The pregnancy hadn't been easy. Bobbi had spent months on bed rest while their older daughter, Michaela, just a year old herself, was cared for by relatives and neighbors who formed an invisible network of support around the McCaughey family. The doctors had been frank about the risks. They'd used words like selective reduction, and medical impossibility, and unprecedented challenges. But Kenny and Bobbi, their faith as sturdy as the Iowa soil Kenny worked, had made their choice. They would trust in something bigger than medical statistics. Now, watching 7 tiny chests rise and fall, some connected to ventilators, others breathing on their own with determined gasps, Kenny felt the weight of that choice settle on his shoulders like a physical thing. How would they afford 7 cribs? 7 high chairs? 7 everything? The farm barely supported their family of 3. The small house they lived in had 2 bedrooms. Where would 7 more human beings fit? "They're beautiful," Bobbi whispered from the hospital bed, her voice weak but filled with something Kenny recognized as pure steel beneath the exhaustion. "They're going to be okay." And somehow, impossibly, they were. The days that followed the birth blurred into a surreal sequence of moments that Kenny would later struggle to remember clearly. The hospital staff became like family, teaching them to manage feeding schedules that required round-the-clock coordination. 7 mouths to feed, every 3 hours, meant that feeding never truly stopped. It meant that sleep became a foreign concept, something from another lifetime. But then something extraordinary happened. The community of Carlisle, Iowa, did what small communities do best: they rallied. The local news picked up the story, and within days, the national media arrived. Camera crews set up outside the hospital. Reporters wanted interviews. The McCaughey's, overwhelmed and exhausted, were thrust into a spotlight they never sought. What came next was a tidal wave of human kindness that would sustain them through the impossible years ahead. A local construction company offered to build an addition to their home. Not a small addition, but a sprawling expansion with 5 bedrooms, a kitchen large enough to manage feeding 7 toddlers simultaneously, and living spaces designed specifically for their unique family. Volunteers from across Iowa showed up with hammers and paintbrushes, turning the construction project into a community celebration. A grocery chain committed to providing the family with diapers, formula, and food for the first several years. A furniture company delivered 7 cribs, 7 high chairs, 7 of everything the babies would need. A van dealership gifted them a vehicle large enough to transport their suddenly enormous family. Strangers from across the country sent checks, gifts, letters of encouragement, and prayers. Kenny watched it all unfold with a mixture of gratitude and humility that sometimes brought him to tears when he was alone in the barn. He was a simple man, a farmer who understood hard work and simple faith. This outpouring of generosity from strangers felt like something sacred, like witnessing grace in action. But the real work was just beginning. As the girls grew from fragile newborns into thriving infants, the reality of raising septuplets settled into the McCaughey household like a permanent guest. The house became a precisely orchestrated operation. Color-coded schedules covered the walls. Each girl, Alexis, Natalie, Kelsey, Natasha, Brandon, and Joel, yes, 2 boys arrived among the 7, though the media often got this detail wrong, along with their big sister Michaela, developed their own personality almost immediately. The terrible 2s arrived multiplied by 7. The potty training years nearly broke both parents. Elementary school meant 7 different reading levels, 7 different friendship dramas, 7 different parent-teacher conferences. Kenny took on extra work while still managing the farm. Bobbi became a master of efficiency, capable of braiding hair, checking homework, and mediating disputes with the skill of a corporate CEO. But they also became a unit, this family of 9. The children learned early to help each other, to share, to work together because survival required it. Older siblings helped younger ones. The septuplets developed a bond that outsiders found almost mystical. They seemed to communicate in ways that went beyond words, finishing each other's sentences, knowing instinctively when one of them was struggling. The media attention never fully went away. Every birthday became a photo opportunity. Every milestone was documented. The McCaughey's tried to maintain normalcy, to give their children as regular a childhood as possible, but normal was something they'd never really know. The teenage years brought new challenges. 7 teenagers learning to drive. 7 proms. 7 first heartbreaks. 7 different dreams about the future. The expanded house that had seemed so spacious when the girls were small suddenly felt cramped with 8 teenagers navigating their identities and independence. There were moments when Kenny stood in the doorway watching his children, no longer children, really, but young adults, and marveled at the journey. The nights he'd wondered if they'd survive financially. The times Bobbi had cried from exhaustion. The fears about whether they could possibly give each child enough individual attention, enough love, enough of themselves. But love, they discovered, wasn't a finite resource that needed to be divided. It multiplied. It expanded to fill whatever space was required. As high school graduation approached, Kenny and Bobbi faced a new worry: college. 7 tuitions. 7 different schools potentially. How could they possibly afford it? But again, the universe seemed to conspire in their favor. Scholarships arrived. Financial aid packages came through. The same spirit that had built their house extension years earlier manifested in academic institutions willing to support this extraordinary family. 37 years later, the little girls who had entered the world amid such drama and uncertainty have become women with their own stories. Some married, starting families of their own, making Kenny and Bobbi grandparents multiple times over. Some pursued careers in medicine, teaching, business. They scattered across the country, building lives as unique and individual as their fingerprints. But they always come home. The house in Carlisle, Iowa, now quiet most of the year, explodes with noise and laughter when the McCaughey clan gathers. 8 children, their spouses, their own children. The family that once seemed impossibly large has grown even larger, multiplying love across generations. Kenny, now in his 70s, moves slower than he used to. The farm is managed differently now. But when he sits on the porch watching his grandchildren play, some of them forming their own sibling bonds reminiscent of their parents, he thinks about that day in 1987. That moment when 7 cries filled the delivery room and his entire world changed in an instant. People often ask him how they did it. How did they manage the impossible? How did they raise 7 children born on the same day and give each one what they needed? Kenny's answer is always the same, spoken with the simple wisdom of someone who lived through something extraordinary: we didn't do it alone. We were carried by kindness. We were lifted by community. We were sustained by faith and by the goodness of people who had no reason to care about a farming family in Iowa except that they chose to care. The McCaughey septuplets story isn't ultimately about medical miracles or statistical improbabilities. It's about what happens when ordinary people face extraordinary circumstances with courage, when communities rally around those in need, when strangers choose kindness over indifference. It's a reminder that we're not meant to face impossible things alone. That sometimes our greatest strength comes not from what we can accomplish independently, but from our willingness to accept help, to be vulnerable, to let others carry us when we can't walk on our own. 37 years after 7 tiny girls entered the world against impossible odds, they stand as living testaments to human resilience, to the power of community, and to the simple truth that love, real, sacrificial, multiplying love, can sustain us through anything. Their story continues to inspire because it reminds us of something we desperately need to remember: that we're all in this together, and sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply show up for each other, again and again, in the small and large moments that make up a life.